Okay, welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see that we have some of our participants here. We're going to go ahead and get started, and then if we have others join us, that's fine. For those of you who have not been at one of our webinars before, welcome. My name is Michelle Regan. I'm one of the managing directors here at Inspired Instruction. And today we're going to be talking about communication and connection, really looking at SEL. And how we do that during this very unique and very stressful time of distance learning. So we'll be using a couple of things to think about. We'll be using the chat feature a couple of different times throughout where you can respond or you can use it to post a question. We will also have a Q&A at the end. So certainly feel free to jot things down and you can save it till that time. I did have a few questions already come in from people who could not attend. So we'll definitely try to address those. Okay. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to hope that my slides move when I ask them to. There we go. All right. So today, the intent of today really, the takeaways are for you to leave here at the end of the webinar with these 4 things having been accomplished. So how do we address the emotions of students and deal with their anxieties? And when you entered, if you saw the chat, I asked you just to jot down your name and your role, because I do know today we'll be having people of various backgrounds. So we have people that are joining us that are guidance counselors. We have people that are joining us that are school administrators, principals. We have some coaches and teachers. So I want you to keep that hat on as you go through. So in whatever way you work with students and support students and families, kind of have that hat on. And again, feel free to ask questions about, well, how could I do this even though I'm not the classroom teacher? Okay. So you should be able to walk away today with having some strategies for helping kids address their emotions and deal with their anxieties. How to create community and help kids stay connected. How to engage students in pro-social behavior. So all of those things that we know from the SEL competencies that New Jersey put out in 2017, we know we're supposed to be engaging in those on a daily basis with students in the classroom, but how do we do that in this virtual setting? Okay, and then lastly, and probably most importantly, so you'll see when we start, we're gonna actually start with this, is how do we balance the care that we give to our students and caring for ourselves at the same time. Okay. So before we jump into the webinar, I thought I would just take a minute and see if I could have you all respond. I'm going to open up the chat feature. We've been hearing quite a bit about, in the past week, I would say, administrators, educators are already talking about what they're calling the COVID slide. So it's this idea of the summer slide, 2.0, that students had this pause in instruction, and what does that mean for September? So if you wouldn't mind, in the chat, I would just love if you put down what challenges do you think you're going to be facing, knowing that this COVID slide or this possible loss of learning for students is going to exist. So if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, I would love to see sort of what everybody's thinking. Does everyone know how to use the chat? You should be able to see on your bar up top, if you go to more, you can click on chat, and it can also be used by hitting Alt-H. Okay. So I'm going to give everybody a minute. So that's the first thing I was kind of thinking about. And then the second question I wanted to ask you was really, how are people thinking about using this summer? Because we're hearing a lot of talk and there's lots of different articles in the media coming out about talking about how to, if to use the summer. So if that's something that you're thinking about or your district's talking about, we'd love to hear from you. So I see, is that Jennifer? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Students will be overwhelmed when they're coming back. So, definitely we're hearing, and I absolutely understand. I have 2 high schoolers that we're trying to do this with. And I'm sure you would agree, every student learns differently. And so I'm seeing a big difference in how my two high schoolers are approaching at-home learning. And so I think that's something really important we have to consider is, was this successful for some kids or not so much? So I think that's a good one to consider. The state of anxiety, a lot of what ifs. You're going to hear us talk about that today. So I absolutely understand that that's going to be a concern for September. And then getting back to the routine, that's going to be interesting. So thank you for Carice for putting that. In some ways, I think kids are going to be drawn to that routine and be like needing the structure of the routine. But I do worry also that they were out of their routine quite a bit. Some schools at-home learning does require some level of structure, requires kids to check in at a certain time, that type of thing. Others are not. And we're really expecting students to be very independent. So this is going to be interesting, but I really appreciate that feedback. It's going to help us as we go forward in terms of how we're supporting our teachers. Okay, and I also see a lot of uncertainty, anxiety. You know, we're all feeling the same thing. The whole idea of the lost family members, I think that brings it to a whole nother level. And what we're going to be talking about today, I always say this when we talk about SEL, this does not replace mental health resources. So please know that if you have students that are really struggling with issues that require mental health resources, please, refer them to that. These are just the things that we can do to try to make what is not normal be okay. All right, so that's how I want to start. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to close this for now. But that's how I would like to start, is with this idea of it. It really struck me last night as I was preparing for this, is this idea of, I saw a quote yesterday that said, it's okay to not be okay. And I agree 100%. I don't think any of us are our normal selves. However, that being said, I think we're in a very unique position as educators that we have to be aware of this idea that just like if we were not healthy physically, we would try different things. We would try different remedies. We would take the Advil. We would stretch or do yoga or what have you. We would try different things. We'd call the doctor. If we are not feeling okay, socially, emotionally, mentally, we can't just let that go ignored. And so I think that's really important to acknowledge. Things are very unusual, out of the ordinary. We are not our normal selves. We are not okay. But the caveat to that is, what do we do with that? How do we address that? Okay, so let's start with this. I'm going to ask you to think about what is the first word that comes to mind when I ask you, how are you feeling? I'm sure something has jumped out at you immediately. So why am I asking you this? Because a survey was done at the end of March. So it feels like forever ago, but really was less than a month ago. 5,000 educators were given a survey, and this is what they came up with. They were asked, what were the 3 most frequent emotions they feel each day? Let me know if one of these answers is what you put. If you're unmuted, feel free to share verbally if you want to in the chat. Did anybody put or think of one of these words? I can tell you that I would probably have chosen anxious and overwhelmed. Because, like somebody already said, of the unknown, the fear of the unknown and the what ifs. So thanks, Carice, for jotting down anxious. This is really, really important and goes back to what I said about it's okay to not be okay. Allie just jotted down overwhelmed. I think the issue here is that these are not emotions that just come and go. They impact everything we do. Okay, and that being said, what do we do with that? Because guess what? As you already know, we're trying to do our personal lives at the same time that we're trying to do our professional lives. So if you look at this slide, this is the way that the brain works. All of those emotions that we just mentioned impact attention and learning. our ability to make decisions, our ability to form and maintain relationships, and any workplace performance that has now been moved to the home. This feeling of anxiety and being overwhelmed is absolutely going to impact what you do on a daily basis for and with your students. So that being said, we need to move forward in this webinar and move forward in our work, thinking about ourselves before we even dive in to working with our students. I hope that makes sense to people. Okay, because if we're feeling the stress, the anxiety, the feeling of frustration or being overwhelmed, that's going to come across to students. Okay, when we're working to connect and communicate with students, we want to think about a couple of things. Okay, what is it that we are feeling? And this strategy in particular, think about yourself, but also think about how you could use this with your students. So whenever we're having any emotion and we're kind of feeling it, that's what we have to do. We have to feel it. We have to name it, label it. We want to identify what it is that we're feeling. And then we have to figure out a couple of different ways that we could deal with it. Okay, so if you have a go-to method of dealing with it, and I'm thinking not just about myself, but about my kids or my students, if you have a go-to method, that may or may not be successful. So we want to come up with a couple of ways that this can be dealt with. Okay, does it mean taking a break and going outside and taking a walk? Does it mean, having a conversation with somebody straight away? So you're going to want to come up with those strategies, and then you have to choose one. So I love this kind of quick phrase that you can say to students: feel, deal, choose. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some activities and strategies that you can do to help kids do that first part, because I don't know about you, but I think the hardest part for kids is to actually identify how they feel, to give it a name. Okay, so I want to pop this up here. This is from the ruler method. Many of you may be familiar with the Yale University work around social emotional, and I love this mood meter. I'm very visual, so hopefully this will be helpful for you. But the one thing that I was thinking about was, someone says, how are you feeling? You usually say, I'm fine, I'm okay. How are you really feeling? And then the next step for me is to look at this meter, okay? And to see, how can I move myself maybe a little bit higher up on the pleasantness scale? Or how can I increase my energy level? Because words matter. You know that the words that you say, that your students say, matter. And even the words that we say to ourselves, the self-talk, matters. So the other day, a good friend of mine asked me how I was feeling, and I said miserable. Then I looked at this chart and I thought, okay, maybe I'm not really miserable. Maybe I'm just disheartened. This is a bummer. My kids are missing out on tons of things. I'm stressed. So maybe I'm not miserable. Maybe I'm really disheartened. And there's a difference between those two things. Okay, maybe I'm tired. So something like this can be great for yourself, but think about how it might be used with your students. Okay, a lot of students see themselves as either being happy, sad, or mad. There's not a lot of nuance. And so we want to help kids build their emotion vocabulary. Okay, and then what? So then what do we do with it? In your work with kids, if you're doing a Google Classroom, think about ways that you could ask kids to talk more about this. Could they not just name it, but could they share how or why they're feeling? Could they identify how they'd like to feel? So put this up and ask kids, how are you feeling today? Someone identifies, that they're feeling tired. Well, how do you want to feel? You might want to feel just relaxed. So how could we move that? So having a discussion around how do we move ourselves and where's the end goal? So how do you want to feel? And also, let's be realistic. Nobody is going to say, I want to feel thrilled or excited. That's just not our present circumstance. And that's okay. So earlier when I said it's okay to not be okay, that's true, but how can we move ourselves to a healthier place? Okay, write it down. So if you find that you really want to stay energized, write that down, post it somewhere. Ask your students to do that. Have them put it in their bio on their virtual platform. Okay, Some other things that you can do as an educator, and even you can recommend your students do it, have a weekly check-in with one other person. I know many districts are trying to do faculty meetings virtually and PLC meetings. Sometimes that can be a lot. And so what I really recommend is have one person on your staff that you can just check in. Hey, how am I feeling? What's the issue? Where do I want to be? By sharing it, it makes it that much more doable, that you're going to go ahead and work toward that. Okay. And the same for your students. You can have them pair up, or you can even have them reach out to you if you feel like this is somebody that wouldn't pair up with another student. But it's something to consider, having a weekly check-in. The other thing I think about is a gratitude board. So by doing an activity with your kids, we're going to talk more about gratitude when we talk about pro-social behavior, but this would be a nice time too, as you're setting up your virtual platforms. If any of you are doing a Zoom meeting like this, where you're recording yourself, where I have my little poster right here, maybe have a gratitude board. I have one at work. I don't have one at home, but it's filled with colorful Post-its, and it's each thing, each day that I am thankful for this day. Even if things aren't so great, I got my coffee. Okay, so think about having that and having that displayed for students. You can also have them make a virtual gratitude board. We can talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so if anyone has questions, please feel free to throw them up. We'll keep moving on here. Okay, so as I said, this is really, really important in terms of your own feelings, because it is going to come across to students. It's going to come across in the words that you choose, in your facial expressions and body language, and it's also going to come across in the way you respond or lack of response. Okay, if you're not feeling like you have the energy, you may or may not be reaching out to kids regularly. So it's really important to check in with yourself and figure out, how can I move myself to a healthier place, knowing this isn't reality, our normal reality. Okay. Because ultimately it does impact our students. And that's, it's a really important thing for us to consider. If you have kids that are stressed, students that are stressed, that are dealing with parents that are stressed, and now if their teacher is stressed and that comes across, that's not going to be a winning situation. Okay, anyone have any thoughts? They can certainly add them to the chat, because I'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So I will address them as they come in. Okay, I put them as important truths. These are things that we already know, but to be frank, they just look and feel a lot more important right now. Okay, so I'm just going to pop them up. This whole idea of a lack of control really causes anxiety. Negative emotions are okay. So when you see, as we start talking and you start asking your students how they feel, one teacher or administrator addressed with me, but what do I do? What do I do when they say they're sad? What do I do when they say they're angry or they're miserable? And we're going to talk more about that. But the idea here is that by getting kids to name and express the emotion, you've already helped them take a huge step forward. You don't have to have all the answers. What we want to do is listen and acknowledge how students are feeling. Okay, and we already talked about the mood meter, and that's also one way to address it. Okay, don't assume students have support at home. I think as students, as teachers, we know that there are different groups of students, some who do have support, some who don't, for various reasons. In this situation, I think we should assume that nobody is really getting a lot of support, because we're in this situation where we're also working from home, and we're also stressed about loved ones' health and money and all of those kinds of things. So we want to make sure that any of the assignments that we're giving, any of the deadlines that we're giving, really take into mind that kids are likely going to be doing these things independent. Okay? I'm going to constantly come back to this idea of less is more. There are really lots and lots of resources that are out there. And when this first started, I saw on Facebook and on other places, tons of resources being shared. While that is great, what concerns me about that is it's very overwhelming. I'd much prefer to see 1 or 2 resources be shared with students or with parents than 15, because quite frankly, it becomes a lot and they don't want to read another email or see another post about another resource that they may or may not want to be involved with. So just keep that in mind. And also try to consider that all academics should really be viewed through an SEL lens at this point. So as a mom, when my kids get their assignments, I have to be honest, I'm thinking about, is this meaningful? Is there a purpose to this? Is this a good use of their time? And then is this helping them deal with stress, or is this adding stress? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want rigorous assignments. It just means we want to make sure that they have meaning and purpose. Okay. And lastly, having empathy is so critical. And yes, for your students, but also for yourselves, because beating ourselves up is certainly not going to help us be effective. Okay. So now that we have those truths, let's sort of address this communication piece. So how are we communicating with our students? Some of you may have a daily platform to work with their students or to speak with their students, either in writing or in like a Zoom meeting, a face-to-face. So I know your circumstances are different, but the idea here is there should be a way that you can interact with students that they can connect with you. Because out of anything that they miss from school, it's you. All right. So if you're a middle school teacher and they have 6 other teachers, it's just as important for them to see all 6. If this is an elementary school child that you are their world, they certainly want to see you. So you want to consider, how can you connect with students? In doing that, making that connection and communicating with them, how can you ask questions that are age appropriate, that get to the heart of the matter in terms of their fears, their emotions? Okay, so first and foremost, I talk about that they should be age appropriate. And I'm going to give you some examples now. And then after the webinar, if you're interested, I can send you these examples. Okay, but you'll see that I have this, what I call fist to 5, and you may have seen this. But with young children, or really with anyone, if you're using Zoom, you're using some kind of, I'm using the word Zoom, but some kind of face-to-face live chat like we are doing now, you can have kids show you, how am I feeling today? A fist is 0, and that means I'm not feeling great. I'd much rather not be on this live chat right now. At a 5, I'm feeling pretty great. This was a good day. Okay, so think about that in terms of your students. If you want to do some direct questioning, you might do that. But then on other days, you might just use the fist to 5. Okay, so let's talk about some kinds of questions. I have to admit, I did not make these questions up. I found them. I have the resources listed at the end of this webinar, and there's some great resources. But I really thought that these were some great questions. So very directly asking young kids, is there anything about coronavirus that makes you scared or makes you afraid? And that's very direct about coronavirus. But then you can switch to things like, how are you feeling about what's going on? Is there anything you need to talk about? Okay, is there anything you need advice on? Okay, I've been very interested to see that there are kids that are feeling stressed because their parents might be fighting, because everybody's in the house and we're all trying to use the same resources at once, and this is just different. Okay, even a simple question like, is there anything that makes you nervous or worried? Okay, how has staying home impacted your behavior, your thinking, your living? I really like that for the high school students because yes, their world has changed for sure. Okay, you could ask, how has this situation made you more anxious or impacted your mood? Okay, so these are questions that can kind of just open up to get to how kids are feeling and their emotions. Then the next question is, what do we do with that? So once we figure out and get them talking about how they're feeling, we want to talk about after that is, now what do we do with those feelings? Okay, especially if they're negative emotions. All right, so some of the questions you might want to consider to start a discussion about dealing with emotions are things like talking about their day. So what activities can you do today that can make you feel, fill in the blank? So it could be feel better, it could be feel happy. If you were using that mood meter, It could be directed as to what kids picked as their end goal, where they want to be. So it could just be, again, we're maybe not excited, but maybe, what did we say? There was one that said chill or relaxed. So these are strategies that you're helping kids to brainstorm, okay? We want to come to this discussion with ideas. So you're going to want to come with a couple of things that you might suggest to students. You might even share what you do, okay? But you want this time to really be a discussion and a brainstorming session, because as we know, kids are different. Not everything works for everybody. It's going to be trial and error to find what works. And so it's important to have multiple strategies or opportunities, okay? So talking to kids about activities, talking to them about who can you talk to when you're sad? Who can you talk to about the current situation? Okay. Also, things like processing our thoughts. So what if someone says to you, I'm not sure how I feel. I don't know. Then you can have a question like, what might be a good way to process how we're feeling? Now, obviously, you can't ask that to a kindergartner, but even if young kids came to you and said, I'm not sure, I don't know, maybe we could have them draw, okay? So draw how you feel, and then after they're done with their drawing, maybe they could put a little caption, or maybe we could just tell when they show their drawing how they're feeling, okay? As kids get older, we can start asking very pointed questions like, what can we do to have a more positive outlook? Or, it's totally okay to be afraid, but how do we let it not consume us? Okay. And then the last one I really love, and I feel like this question can really be for any age, is how can people help each other? Because we've seen so many examples of that kind of support in the community, whether it's people bringing food to nurses or celebrating and doing parades outside of hospitals. We've seen so many ways the community can connect. So ask the kids, how can people help each other? If you had a kid come into a virtual class that was upset that day, and then you all talked about ways that people help each other, you could really make a positive impact on how that student is feeling and what actions they might take. Okay. Okay. So to continue to build connection, we talked about having the discussions. What else? What else can you do to make connections? So I think an important piece is knowing that technology does not replace you. It does not replace the teacher or the guidance counselor or even the principal. So what do I do when I'm doing virtual activities? Acknowledge kids. Acknowledge their presence. Even if you're doing asynchronous, so we are not live, you've posted a video or you've posted a discussion question. Acknowledge their presence at some point in some other communication. So you respond to the discussion board by saying, Allie, thanks for sharing that. Jen, I really liked when you said blank. Okay. Not only do you want to acknowledge them, their name, but also indicate that you heard them by using their ideas. So if you did a question about how can people help each other and students responded, again, this might be verbally in a Zoom chat, it might be in a discussion board, it might be an assignment that they had to write. Respond with their specific ideas and examples. Because the ultimate goal here is letting kids know that they're being seen and they're being heard. Okay? I think the exact same thing about students interacting with one another. I know, again, I have high schoolers. They're missing their friends. So if any possible way exists for you to have kids be able to talk to one another or engage with one another in maybe the first 5 minutes of a chat, or maybe you post some discussion questions and one is personal and 2 are academic. Just giving kids an opportunity to connect with one another. Okay. Any thoughts or questions here? Because there are certainly other specific techniques that you could do to connect kids with each other. I just want to make sure I'm covering everything we had on the agenda today. No? Okay. So we'll, again, offer the opportunity to ask questions at the end. Okay. But another really important piece, and you saw me in the beginning put up that one of the truths was lack of control produces anxiety. So how can we give kids back control? And I'm going to use these two examples or these two phrases, voice and choice. Okay. So we want to consider how can we offer kids the opportunity to make choices and let their voice be heard. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples. And again, if you want this in writing, I can share this with you after the fact. So voice, ask them questions, not just about their lives or academics, but about this process. So specifically, what rules or norms are working? What's not working? What needs to be tweaked? You know, if your rule is that during Zoom, from the time they come in to the time they leave, they have to be muted and it's just about listening to you, ask the students, is there something that they would change about the rules? Now, obviously, we're going to tailor that to the student's age. We want to keep in mind how it's been going so far, but certainly giving kids a voice, okay? Also inviting them to tell you what else would support them. Okay, my son said to me last night, he's a senior in high school, and he said to me last night, you know, I think my teachers think they're helping by posting everything in Google Classroom in a different folder. He said, I think that they think that's more organized. He said, but for me, I would like it so much more if all the things I needed for an assignment were in one folder. So I thought that kind of feedback was great. And maybe the teacher has no idea that this is an issue for kids. Okay. And also just any feedback about the lessons. So for example, you might put a self-assessment or a little, you know, how was it doing this assignment? If you assign something on a Monday and expect it back on Friday, there are many kids that works really, really well for. But there are other kids that without you checking in on them are going to struggle to get it done until Thursday night. Okay, so maybe just asking for some feedback. In terms of choice, what choices can you offer in terms of one option? So are there any assignments that you are giving kids that there is a choice? So if they're responding to a question, can they do it verbally or via creating a diagram or an illustration? Is there a way for them to respond to something, maybe doing Google Slide using visuals? Okay, so consider all of those things. That would be a fairly simple switch. With any of the things we're talking about, you want to go for simple. Okay, so your students may know a lot better than you how to use Google Slides. Putting it out there and saying, hey, if anyone wants to do this as a Google Slide instead of a Google Doc in writing, go for it. And then take a look at it and go from there. You don't have to have everything in a perfect, polished format. I think that's an important bit of advice is, again, going back to what's the meaning, what's the purpose, are students gaining something from this, or is this busy work? Okay. Consider giving them a choice in working together. For some kids, working together online is much easier than working together face-to-face. For those introverts and shy kids, they don't mind being behind the screen and providing some input to a peer. Whereas in person, that would be very difficult for them. So there are different ways that you can assign group work. You can, if you're using Google, you can use the Google Chat feature and assign specific students, and they have their own little group to chat with. Obviously, any of the tools through Google that can be shared, you can assign kids in small groups to complete a Google Doc with a list of questions that they have before you take a quiz, you know, that type of thing. Okay, so opportunities for them to get involved with their peers. So that's the idea of giving kids back some of this control. Okay. How can we create community? So here are a few ideas. We talked about video chatting, what I'm doing today. You can make some virtual clubs. So I love doing a virtual book club. My son started this in 5th grade. It was probably the best thing ever. And I'm going to give you a little insight here. He came home from school and he said, I much prefer when we do the book club online, because he was in a club with all girls. And he said, at school, they're really bossy. But at home, I get the chance to say a complete thought. And so he was able to really, really show his thoughts and not be interrupted, if that makes sense. So again, offering some virtual clubs, book clubs, you know, for the sciences or social studies, you could have various, you know, a club, quote unquote, for something that you're learning. Okay. And then any personal connection that you can make with students. Yes, you have some format that you're connecting with them, but have they heard from you personally, you know, Mrs. Regan to Tommy? Okay. So whether that be, depending on the age of the student, an email, a text, a note on the discussion board, something that's more personal. Okay. Okay. And then what else works in terms of creating community? I think this really depends on the age of the student, and certainly your own resources. You're not going to have everything from your classroom, but here's an example, and you can see examples online on Facebook and different social media platforms of what people have done to make it more of a community. Again, please keep in mind, we want to keep it simple. We would not be recreating this every single day. Whatever you put together, you know, again, we want to simplify it. Is there anything at all that you can bring from your current classroom? And when I say bring, I don't mean physically necessarily, but do you have a classroom or a school mascot? Is there some sort of slogan that you use with your students? If, you know, the school call and response signal for my kids was, they were the Van Holten Huskies. And when you say Huskies, they have to say woof. You know, if there's different things that you can bring from the routine that you had before, that's a great thing to integrate to make you feel like, make kids feel like they're part of a community. If there's not a lot of that you can do, what can you do that's new? Again, that's simplified. So depending on the kid's age, can you have a class hashtag? Can you do a Google form or a survey and ask kids, for the next live chat, what background do you want me to use for Zoom? And put 3 choices and have kids click on that. Just very simple ways to really make kids feel like they are part of a community. Okay. And again, I think about this idea of keeping it simple, because if you're spending half an hour to an hour on every 2-minute video or, you know, something like that, you're going to make yourself crazy. Okay. So we really want to keep it simple. Okay. So I want to get to this piece about pro-social behavior because we're running out of time, but I think this is such an ideal time for us to consider these elements of our social emotional competencies. Is, are we able to use this and leverage this time to really work on things such as empathy, kindness, gratitude. Okay, so how do we do that? I mentioned earlier, all teaching should be viewed through the SEL lens. So considering that, what stories can you share that come from other people's perspectives? It can be something that happened to you or something that happened to your own children, or in your own neighborhood or community if you don't live in the area that you teach. Okay, this can just be a verbal story. You might also include text, literature, nonfiction that comes from other perspectives to really have students start to be able to take on other people's perspectives and walk in somebody else's shoes. I couldn't think of a better time to do that than now. Can you share video clips or news stories about people working together? Like I mentioned to you about people celebrating nurses, or the people in New York City every night at 7 p.m. when they clap for the frontline workers. Anything like that can really give kids a quick view into real life ways that gratitude and kindness are being shared. Okay. Think about having assignments that allow for some interconnectedness. So maybe you use Google Keep or something like Padlet, where each student has their own virtual Post-it note. And so everybody gets a voice, but it's through the work together as a group that we actually create something really special. Okay. And then the whole idea of an attitude of gratitude, I think this is something that you can model again by doing something like the gratitude board or some other activities that this is what we talk about. Yeah, this is hard, but is there something that you're grateful for? Okay, let's think about the routines that you might have in your virtual learning. Can any of these be added in, be embedded? So can you do a little SEL starter? So at the start of class, you want kids to see a word or see a quote and have them respond. So you have the word courage in all caps. And you basically just have a free-form response. What does this mean to you? Okay. You might have a quote and have students think about, how does this reflect something in your own life? A real quick, and you let kids know, I expect you to spend 3 minutes on this. There is not a right or wrong answer. Okay, this would be a great way to introduce some of those concepts that we were talking about, like gratitude, like kindness, like courage, okay? All of those kinds of things. And then brain breaks. Are we allowing kids an opportunity to take a break? If you have multiple assignments, I would actually put into your assignments, here's a brain break. I want you to do the pretzel. I want you to stand up, cross your legs, cross your arms, and try to touch your nose with your tongue. Okay, silly stuff. For older kids, it can be stretching. It could be, I tell my own kids, go for a quick run around the house. Go up and down the steps a couple of times. Okay, because we know from research that movement and mindfulness really does help focus kids for academics. Okay, lastly, this idea of lessons learned, it can be a reflection, it can be an exit ticket, and again, change it up. It doesn't have to always be writing. You can say something like, draw 3 pictures that show what you're grateful for today. Okay, or, make up a symbol that represents blank feeling. Okay, these lessons learned may or may not be connected to a specific assignment that you gave them in your academics. So if you're a math teacher, you can still do these things. You don't have to do your exit ticket about math all the time. You could say something like, what's something that was hard and how did you overcome it? What was an obstacle you felt like this week and what did you do to overcome it? Okay, because when this experience is over, what I think we really hope is that some of the lessons that we learned about ourselves and about others is what's going to remain, right? If kids can take some life lessons out of this, that's what's going to be really important. Okay, we're going to wrap it up with this last piece about self-care. Hopefully, a lot of the strategies that we talked about, you noticed they're just as important or just as useful for yourself, okay? But I do want to mention just a few others. The idea of mindfulness is just really so powerful. And this could be as simple as what we call the mindful minute, literally taking 60 seconds and having a picture that you focus on. Post some pictures of something like your favorite place or your happy place. It could be something like, what I love to do is when I can get out, go for a walk. And it's called a sensory walk. So you're just focusing on, what do you hear, right? So I'm outside for 15 minutes and I'm focusing on all of the sounds of my neighborhood. You might have kids that can't do that, or you might live in a place that you can't really get outside right now. So there's something called the Mindful Minute video series. And if you're interested, I can share that link with you. It's in the resources. Again, 60 seconds of a beautiful beach scene or a sunset, those types of things. Movement for yourself, taking breaks. During your day, if you can step away and again, walk up the stairs, do a crazy yoga pose, something that's giving you that break, I think is really important. Oh, I just saw some posts. Okay, I love this. The Brooklyn Botanical Gardens has a nice 20-minute walk in the park. Any of those virtual things I think are great. When this first happened, someone posted I think it's called the Musée d'Orsay, the museum in Paris. And I spent about 20 minutes looking at different pieces in there. So I think making these very, being intentional about it. So saying to yourself, I'm going to work from this time to this time, and then I'm going to move. I'm going to work from this time to this time, and then I'm going to do some kind of mindfulness activity. Okay. Also self-talk. Oops, sorry. I want to go back to that self-talk. If I can get it there. Self-talk I mentioned in the beginning is so super powerful. So try to really flip the script. If you're feeling, sorry about that. If you're feeling tired or miserable or cranky, that's my favorite one to say, cranky. My kids ask me all the time. Try to flip the script. And a good activity to do is take a Post-it note or an index card. I don't know why that's doing that. I apologize. But take an index card, write the way you're feeling, and then flip it over with the new way that you want to feel. Okay? I don't know what just happened. Okay, so it looks like we finished up. And what I would really love to do is I'm just going to open the chat feature for questions. Okay. Because I think that at this point, we tried to offer a lot of, different strategies, techniques, thoughts, things for you to think about. There really is no one right answer. So I don't want you to walk away from today thinking, well, I'll never be able to do that. Therefore, I'm not meeting my, kids' needs. Not at all. There are lots of different ways that this can be successful. Oh, good. And I see someone said, can we get a copy of this presentation, that you loved the ideas? Yes, if you, obviously you signed up and I sent you the link, so I have your information. I can absolutely send it to you. And if in your specific role, I don't know why all these things are coming up. I apologize. My computer's going crazy. If there are things that are in your specific role were helpful. So for example, if you are a guidance counselor and you found specific things helpful, I would love to hear about that. If you're an administrator and other things were helpful, that's important for me to hear too. So I will follow up with each of you. Again, thank you so much for your attendance and for sharing via the chat. And I will follow up with this presentation, as well as if you're interested in those questions that you can share with if you have teachers, feel free to share that. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Thank you. Take care.